Hello and welcome to the RAC Fleet Risk Management webinar. My name is Martin Moore. The aim of this webinar is to get to the very heart of fleet risk management, and I have with me today two industry experts, RAC Steve Whitmarsh and Dave Abbott. In a moment we'll be going through a presentation on risk management with advice, information and food for thought for all fleet operators. The presentation slides are visible in the window to the right on your browser. And underneath us in your browser window is a text input area where you can type comments, opinions and questions. We'll be having a Q&A session at the end of the broadcast, so feel free to interact and take advantage of the opportunity to ask some experts some questions. First of all, I've got a little bit of housekeeping. Now, this webinar is intended to give a general overview of the subject matter and is not intended to be advice given to any individual or covering your specific circumstances. The RAC and its presenters will not be liable for any reliance made on any advice given or comments made during the webinar. RAC Risk Management provides consultancy services if you would like specific advice on any matter, and we'll be giving contact details for all those services at the end of the broadcast. Right, to business. Steve Whitmarsh heads Fleet and Commercial Services at RAC. His team looks after all areas of fleet and commercial breakdown. That's 2 million assets. Dave Abbott is Director of RAC Risk Management, and after spending 30 years in the police service, he switched his talents to fleet driver training. In his spare time, he drives a Formula 3 racing car. Gentlemen, we have gathered to discuss grey fleet today, and we've decided that by building our conversation around grey fleet, we get to cover off many aspects of fleet management, because I think it's widely accepted that grey fleet presents some very specific problems, and so they deserve to be addressed. We'll be looking at what we exactly mean by grey fleet, why managing grey fleet drivers is such a problem, grey fleet vehicles and their fitness for purpose, and how we make sure that grey fleet vehicles are safe and legal. And we're also going to look at duty of care and how it applies to all vehicles driven on business. One of the areas that I'd like to explore at some point is this notion of a permit to drive. So Steve, first of all, if I can start with you perhaps, tell us a little bit about the background, how we arrive at the situation we're in today.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. This all started in the 1990s, early 1990s, when the government, through the Health and Safety Executive, started to ask about fatalities out on the road, how many there were, and who it was that were who these fatalities were. And as a result, they found that a large proportion of these fatalities were people driving on business, around about a third. And as a result, in 2003, the Health and Safety Executive launched their Driving at Work guide, and as part of that, defined the vehicle as a place of work, which essentially meant that any vehicle that used on business was the same, had the same health and safety rules and regulations applied to it as if you were running a machine in a factory or if you were on a construction site. So the same Health and Safety at Work Act applied if you're in a vehicle used for business. This dovetailed quite nicely with the government strategy at the time to reduce fatalities on the road, and as a large proportion of those fatalities were from business users, this meant that the government had a better bang for their buck and were able to target the largest area that were causing these fatalities.
So the government felt that it could access at-work drivers more easily than the general motorist who's, sort of doing the shopping run or the school run. Obviously bound by road traffic laws and the normal laws of the land, but using the employer to push through legislation onto the driver on company business, it was felt that they would effect greater control.
The reality, of course, is that traffic law still applies to all drivers, and they have individual responsibility to perform properly, but quite clearly the target area of business drivers was something that the government could address fairly simply without too much expense. Not to say they weren't dealing with road safety overall, because that certainly has been the case, but business drivers became a natural target, and so it is today.
We've just had a change of government. Is there any sense that the new administration will look at this any differently? Are we likely to see greater legislation or remain on the same course, or how's that going to affect it?
I would expect the government to remain on the same course.
Okay.
I'd agree with that.
Dave,
yeah,
talk a little bit about where we've come from since the 1990s, because as I understand it, the policy that's been adopted by the government has been pretty effective.
Yes, that's right. General perception, of course, is that fatalities are going up as we have more and more motor cars on the road in the UK, 31 million at this moment in time. But if we go back into the 90s, when we had less than 20 million vehicles on the road, the fatality number was 5,800 or thereabouts. We plateaued there for a while, and now we've seen improvements coming down through the 3,000 numbers to the biggest improvement of all this last year, 2008, to 2,538, which is the lowest figure that we've ever had. Quite clearly, that's a huge improvement, and I guess that amongst other things, that makes us one of the safest countries in Europe. We know that in the EU the fatality numbers are huge. There were about 39,000 deaths on the road in the EU last year, and they've discovered very much the similar numbers to Steve earlier on, quoting a third. The EU are now saying 39% of the fatalities in Europe were driving on business. So that's quite clearly a big target wherever we look. And I guess there have been some strategic moves that have changed those numbers. And if we think about it, probably the most significant change is vehicle technology. Steve will tell you about the changes in vehicles that we've seen over the years. A huge investment.
Tell us, Steve.
Indeed, I've worked for a couple of motor vehicle manufacturers, and indeed I've seen first-hand crash testing and some of the technology that's gone into some of the vehicle advancements. That includes material advancements, different use of materials in construction, so there's more energy absorption. Obviously, we're all aware of the increase in use of airbag technology and whiplash protection and that sort of thing, anti-submarine seats. But of course, there's also preventative technology there to stop people having accidents, ABS and traction control and that sort of thing. And we can't underestimate the advancements that manufacturers have made, and that's worked in hand with the governments.
And to be fair, those advancements continue, albeit the emphasis has moved a little from passenger safety to pedestrian and other road user safety, in the shape of motor cars changing with energy absorption in the bonnet area and so on. So that typically motor cars are beginning to look all the same because the regulations drive the shape at the front. So vehicle improvements had a huge influence on the numbers of fatalities. Just how many, difficult to say, but a large proportion of money spent in that area.
What else? I mean, we've listed roads and medical response, and those must also be fairly significant.
Well, I think you have to look around you, and most people won't perceive the changes in the road network that we have. We tend, as drivers, not to notice changes in the road network. Indeed, you even see signs placed to say new roadworks, new road layout ahead, and so on. So there is a difficulty, but quite clearly we have a strategy of keeping vehicles and people apart, and that has gone across our planning regulations for many years. So even new housing estates have private a spinal road with sort of cloverleaf example, so nobody pulls out onto a main road. We have more dual carriageways, bypasses and motorways than ever before. We have pedestrian precincts and out-of-town shopping areas where people don't mix with vehicles. And where you live, then we're into the traffic calming scenario. And that can be anything from bumps and humps and physical narrowings to one-way systems, to paint and road surfaces being changed. All visual and physical means of slowing vehicles down. In fact, you probably, if you think about it, overtaking is a thing of the past in most places because you're deterred from doing that.
All great, and with medical response advancing in the same kinds of ways. You know, we've got paramedics on motorcycles, we've got air ambulances, we've got different ways of treating traumas and managing patients. All of that helps enormously, and the reductions that we've seen are something to be proud of. It's nice to think that the UK is setting the standard for Europe, and will probably result in us influencing European legislation, because often Brussels looks to best practice. So we should be pleased about that. But there is a downside, isn't there? It's not all kind of sweetness and light. It's true, isn't it, that drivers are still having more accidents than ever.
Indeed. Of all the improvements in numbers that we have, there's nothing there that says improved driver behaviour has actually contributed to the reduction.
And this is where we're getting to the nub of it now, isn't it?
I believe so.
We've kind of done maybe not everything we can do to de-risk the vehicle and the roads and the medical responses. There will always be risk attached to moving around in a ton of metal.
And you can see that the government's speed strategy is having an effect. People have slowed down, but inevitably there's less policing, and poor driving behaviour is something you see every day currently.
And I think that's what we need to start to look really closely at now. It is the behaviour of the person behind the wheel. And it's claimed that driver risk is 40% higher when driving on business. Why is that? Why are you more likely to have an accident driving for work?
More distractions, more thoughts going through your mind, thinking of that next meeting.
Time in the car spent travelling between appointments in the past was actually a sort of dead time in your head, but these days there are more and more focus to moving almost towards a mobile office, and the distraction that we face, whether it be electronic or mobile telephones, or even the CD and the toys in the motor car, are quite significant. We get distracted in all sorts of ways. Of course, as human beings, the girls will tell you differently, but as human beings, we don't do two things at once very well, do we?
My wife would agree with you.
Because we do it every day, it's almost overlooked that asking an employee to drive is probably the most dangerous thing you could ask them to do, unless you send them down a coal mine or ask them to work on an oil rig or something like that. It's a pretty high risk activity.
Well, the perception of driving risk it doesn't reflect the real numbers, does it?
No.
It's something that we have become used to as a freedom, and we don't take it seriously. We don't have the same responsibility to driving as perhaps we should. Reality is, of course, that driving mileage in a company scenario exposes you to more risk.
Yeah.
And so the numbers tend to reflect that, and company car drivers generally will have more accidents than private motorists. Their personal risk is higher, probably 40%, which is significant. And if we tell people that 2/3 of company cars effectively crash every year, then that is different from private motorists too. It doesn't mean, of course, that everybody has a go. It means that some of our drivers are having more often the accidents. And the 20/80 rule is quite true. Quite often for companies, there are small proportion of the drivers who have a large proportion of the accidents.
Okay. Let's bring this back round to Grey Fleet and return once more to the concept of duty of care. And Steve, talk to us a little bit about how in the past companies may have been tempted to kind of absolve themselves of responsibility a little bit by encouraging cash for car allowances and reducing the numbers of company cars in the belief that they no longer have to worry about managing that road risk and duty of care.
Yeah, so it's an interesting point actually. I think there's two points here. One is that there has been a move to cash for car, be that however it manifests itself, either a structured employee car ownership plan or a salary sacrifice scheme or pure cash for car. And there's also been a vast outsourcing of fleet management to the large contract hire organisations, and both are a type of outsourcing. So you're outsourcing to the employee when you're doing a cash for car type scheme, and you're outsourcing to a contract hire organisation or a fleet management organisation. But outsourcing, that fleet management responsibility does not outsource the responsibility for health and safety for those drivers, and it's very important to remember that, and this is why Grey Fleet is such an important subject and one that we're trying to cover today.
So the aim is really to encourage employers and responsible organisations to consider all cars that all their drivers are using on company business in the same way as they would manage a company car.
That has to be right. That's the interpretation of the law. Whoever owns the vehicle actually makes no difference to your lawful responsibility about looking after people and, let's face it, looking after the public as well. So the difficulty is that when you outsource the vehicle to somebody else, the controls disappear. And so if we're talking about Grey Fleet and we need to define who Grey Fleet vehicles are, clearly if you give a chap the cash and he's allowed to go and choose his own vehicle, we have worries about that. So a cash for car scenario is certainly Grey Fleet. We also see the use of private vehicles being driven on business on an occasional use, and we clearly will include those vehicles too. And some pool cars and other vehicles that are occasionally used where there is no control is clearly a source of potential.
I suppose it comes down a lot to the definition of driving for work and what are business miles and what are the other types of driving that may be done in relation to work, so commuting, for example. That's not necessarily considered.
You're right.
Work.
Commuting is not considered as driving for business. But of course, there's more than one argument. There's if it's a company vehicle, then Clearly there's a financial interest in accidents whenever they might occur, but for a private vehicle you don't see that. You don't see that physical cost.
So let me give you a hypothetical then. Let's imagine that there's a school canteen worker, and on her way home one evening her supervisor said, oh Doris, can you just call in at the grocer's on your way in to work tomorrow and pick up a load of cabbages and bring them in for school dinners. And Julie does this. She's on her way to work the next day. She stops off at the greengrocer's. She loads the back of the mini metro with cabbages and heads on her merry way to school. Is any part of that journey into school a business journey? And if so, at what point does it become a business journey? When she leaves home? When she leaves the greengrocer's? Does she have to have the cabbages on board? How would people define those various states?
I guess there are two questions for me. One is what would the insurer say if there was an accident? Would they perceive that she was driving under the control of the company or the school? And quite clearly, is it the instruction of or is it a voluntary process? I guess there's no distinct answer. What we are going to see, however, is whenever there is a serious accident, a fatality or a potential fatality, you're going to see an inquiry by the police officer to determine whether that person was driving on business. And I guess that means anything other than commuting. So a trip to another office, a course or a seminar, or even a business trip where you drive to the station and go somewhere other than your normal place of work begins to be conceived as driving.
You could
on
argue
business.
that she was still commuting.
But not a normal commute.
Yeah.
And it's about commuting to your normal place of work.
Yeah.
See, there are no stats here. Because accidents don't get reported by grey fleet drivers, the companies just don't know what's happening. And far more accidents are happening out there that the business doesn't know about. Because they don't have a financial interest, sometimes they won't ever know about.
She would need to make sure the cabbages were secured as well.
It must be loaded very safely, yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, did I interrupt you then?
No, not at all.
Well, I'll let you chat to us then. And I'd like you to take us through the four components, if you like, of health and safety law, as you've defined on the screen there.
Well, I think we need to understand that all of the health and safety regulations that we see in industry now apply to motor cars. We've covered that at the beginning. And clearly the steps that a business need to follow, 4 steps to heaven if you choose those words, determine that there are specific responsibilities. And the first one, as suggested in the HSE Driving at Work booklet, is that there needs to be a work-related road safety policy document. And if we think about that policy, it's slightly different from the core health and safety statements that you would see in the core side of your business, specifically because this is new and because it's come to the forefront at this stage. And if we think about what that policy is about, it has to set out the strategy and the responsibilities for business people to understand what their management responsibilities are, how they would apply the other steps, the risk assessment and training and record keeping parts, and indeed what line managers need to do, what their responsibilities are. And let's not forget the driver responsibility too, because it's easy as a company car driver to think that the business will look after you when you clearly have tasks of your own to perform, looking after the vehicle and so on. So policy is the first step. Risk assessment is a legal requirement, and normally in a business that would be a generic task assessment. But because we're all so different in driving terms, the way the law has been interpreted most often is a individual driver risk assessment. So about your particular circumstances and exposure. One of the key factors in the HSE document is that we are told, and I agree entirely, and you probably will agree with me too, that holding a driving licence is no measure of your competence at all, and all of us have different levels of experience and background and history in that regard. So risk assessment is a tool to focus where we need to apply the right solution. And the regulation says that you should supply appropriate training, appropriate to the risk, I think that should be. And some people will clearly, through their personal profile and experience and exposure, will attract a high level of training, probably hands-on driver training on the road, and others will attract an e-learning process. Some people, of course, with low exposure, good record, may not need any resolution at all and may be perfectly safe. However, the last point, record keeping an audit trail, is absolutely essential because of the way health and safety law is structured. And that's about the onus of proof being reversed. Effectively, what we're saying here is you need to show that you have a reasonable excuse. Otherwise, you might be accused of failing in your duty of care.
Can we explore that a little bit more then?
Yeah.
So, are we saying that essentially an organisation might be assumed guilty of something unless it can provide evidence that it's innocent?
If there's a proven risk, and typically that would be an incident, wouldn't it? And you cannot show that you've taken reasonable steps towards managing that risk, then you might be assumed guilty of failure. Okay, and that's the way the law is structured. And quite clearly, to be able to show what you have done in respect of the business overall and the processes and procedures and individual drivers is absolutely essential to make sure you're safe.
That's quite a sobering thought then, isn't it?
It is a little.
That you have to provide that evidence that... Very good. Well, you've mentioned the policy as point one of those 4 steps to heaven. This was your first step, Dave. And you say a separate work-related road safety policy is advised. What are the other things that policy needs to look at?
I think the responsibility for individuals, health and safety law is based on a check and balance process, and it's no good having senior management buy-in at the top of the company and expect your drivers to perform without having some line management responsibility. And we know that the law has been strengthened lately to make line managers personally responsible for not looking after the team. So they might attract prosecution themselves for not looking after them. So this policy is a communication document. It has to be a living document. It needs to be constructed as a result of consultation. But most of all, it's a communication process so that everybody understands precisely what's expected of them.
Steve, sorry, Dave, can I bring you in on this, Steve?
Sure.
Dave just used the word communication, and we've talked about line managers. And a lot of people out there who are responsible for the operation of the fleet may be trying to get buy-in from people more senior to them in the organisation. What kinds of advice can you give to people to secure that buy-in from people who maybe feel that they're too busy to be, kind of distracted by all these non-core activities, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the barriers to getting buy-in from this is that it's normally a cost or a perceived cost to the business, and we can advise on how we can offset some of those costs with savings in terms of fuel, insurance premiums, and various other areas of running a fleet. And it's about being able to strike that balance, plus also demonstrating to senior management that it's not just the line manager that's on the line here. These regulations go all the way to the very top of that business, and there has to be a demonstration of compliance and of a willingness to embrace this legislation.
So there's a carrot in the sense that you can save money.
And there's a stick as well, and
yeah,
not one that we want to overemphasise particularly, but there is definitely a stick there in terms of
Yeah.
the health and safety at work act.
Well, you'll come on to that in a few moments, I believe.